The night sky over the Gulf turned silent in a way that sailors know means something is wrong. Not the silence of calm water, the silence of radar operators who have stopped talking because every screen in the room just lit up simultaneously. The silence of a combat information center processing data faster than any human voice can describe it. The silence that precedes the announcement nobody on a warship ever wants to hear. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had fired ballistic missiles at the USS Abraham Lincoln. The claim came from Tehran in the early hours, carried by Iranian state media and IRGC statements with the specific operational language of a military organization reporting a completed mission, not a threat, not a warning, a declaration. Multiple ballistic missiles, the IRGC said, had been fired toward the carrier operating in the Gulf, part of what Tehran described as Operation True Promise 4, a sweeping retaliation campaign for the killing of Iran's supreme leader in the American-Israeli strikes that began the previous Saturday. Iranian officials did not hedge their language. Both land and sea, they said, would become a graveyard for aggressors. The IRGC asserted the missiles had struck the carrier. They called it a direct message to Washington and its allies. The world stopped. Because the USS Abraham Lincoln is not a ship in any ordinary sense of that word. Stretching more than 300 meters from bow to stern, nuclear-powered, carrying dozens of advanced fighter jets, it is a floating air base and command center, and one of the most formidable military assets ever built by any nation in any century. It had been deployed to the Gulf specifically as tensions with Iran escalated, positioned as the visible embodiment of American deterrence in the region. The message its presence was supposed to send was simple and ancient. Do not. Iran fired anyway. Within minutes of the IRGC's announcement, every military and political circle on Earth was processing the same question at the same time. Had Iran actually hit it? U.S. Central Command moved quickly. The Abraham Lincoln had not been hit, American officials stated. The missiles had either been intercepted or had not come close to striking the carrier. The warship remained fully operational, they said, continuing its mission despite the heightened tensions. Two narratives, Iran claiming a successful strike, America denying any damage, both sides speaking with the certainty of institutions that cannot afford to appear uncertain. In the absence of independent verification, the gap between those two narratives became the story. And in that gap, in the contested space between Iran's declaration and America's denial, the world understood something that no press conference could fully contain. Ballistic missiles had been fired at a United States aircraft carrier. Whatever the interceptors caught, whatever fell short, whatever the damage assessment eventually concluded, that had happened. In the Gulf, in the year 2026, for the first time in modern naval history, a nation had aimed ballistic missiles at the centerpiece of American naval power and pulled the trigger. The timing made it more significant, not less. The missile launch did not happen in isolation. It came inside a wave of Iranian retaliation that was simultaneously targeting American bases across Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE, striking Allied positions across the region and demonstrating a coordination and reach that the original American operational planning had apparently not fully accounted for. The Abraham Lincoln was not a target of opportunity. It was a signal, chosen specifically because striking it, or attempting to strike it, communicated something that hitting a land base could not. Iran was telling the U.S. Navy it was not safe in the Gulf. For the crew aboard the Abraham Lincoln, the hours that followed were among the most intense of their deployment. Defense systems on full alert, radar tracking multiple vectors simultaneously, command teams in constant communication with CENTCOM headquarters and regional allies. The carrier's entire defensive architecture, layers of interceptors, electronic countermeasures, close-in weapons systems, oriented outward into a gulf that had transformed from a deterrent zone into a combat environment. The stakes required no elaboration. A confirmed strike on an American aircraft carrier would have triggered a chain of consequences that no planning document had fully mapped and no diplomat had a framework to contain. Even without confirmed damage, the attempted strike had crossed a threshold that strategists had long treated as theoretical. Iran had demonstrated the willingness. The question of capability remained partially open, and that partial opening, the uncertainty about whether the next salvo would close it, was the most dangerous thing in the Gulf that night. Governments across the region responded within hours, air defense systems activated, security around critical infrastructure heightened, airlines rerouted flights away from potential conflict zones. Global markets reacted to the news with the specific nervous energy of investors who had been applying a standard geopolitical playbook and were now watching that playbook fail in real time. International leaders issued calls for restraint. The calls landed in an environment where both sides had already made the calculations that precede escalation rather than the calculations that precede de-escalation. Iranian officials stated that their retaliation was justified and would continue as long as attacks on Iranian territory and leadership continued. American officials stated that any direct attack on American forces or assets would be met with a decisive response. Two positions: no overlap, no off-ramp visible from the outside. Behind the public statements, back-channel communications were operating. They operate in every crisis because every military and political institution on Earth understands that the space between declared positions and actual decisions is where wars either widen or stop. Quiet negotiations, intermediary conversations, the infrastructure of de-escalation running in parallel with the infrastructure of escalation, each trying to outpace the other. The challenge in this particular crisis was that the pace of military events was moving faster than the pace of diplomatic communication. Each new strike, each new claim, each new denial compressed the time available for back-channel processes to produce results. Miscalculation in that environment is not a failure of intent. It is a mathematical product of speed and proximity and the irreducible uncertainty of combat. As hours became days, the narrative around the Abraham Lincoln settled into the contested form that would define it. America maintained the carrier was unharmed. Iran maintained it had struck its target. No independent verification resolved the dispute. And in that unresolved space, both sides drew the conclusion that suited their strategic needs, Iran demonstrating resolve and capability to its domestic audience, and to every adversary watching, America demonstrating resilience and operational continuity to its allies, and to every partner whose confidence in American deterrence depended on the carrier remaining untouchable. The truth of the incident may eventually be documented in classified assessments and post-conflict analyses. What was already documented in the immediate hours after the IRGC's announcement was the broader truth the incident revealed. The Gulf was no longer a deterrence environment. It was a combat environment. American naval assets that had operated for decades on the assumption of regional dominance were now operating under direct fire. And the ballistic missiles that had crossed toward the Abraham Lincoln, intercepted or not, struck or missed, had permanently altered the calculation of every naval commander, every defense planner, and every allied government that had built its security architecture around the assumption that American carriers were untouchable. Whether this moment becomes a turning point toward de-escalation or a threshold crossed on the way to something wider will depend on decisions made in the coming days by people operating under pressure, with incomplete information, in a conflict that has already exceeded every timeline and every boundary that the original planning assumed would hold. The Abraham Lincoln is still in the Gulf. Its mission continues. Its crew remains at their stations in waters that are now contested in a way they were not a week ago. Iran fired ballistic missiles at it. That happened. The world knows it happened. And what the world does with that knowledge, how governments respond, how markets price it, how militaries adjust, how diplomats use it, will shape the next chapter of a conflict that has already rewritten every assumption about what this war was supposed to be. Share this with everyone you know right now. Iran fired ballistic missiles at the USS Abraham Lincoln, the first time in modern history a nation has targeted an American aircraft carrier with ballistic missiles. Iran claims a hit. America denies damage. No independent verification exists. The carrier remains in the Gulf. The conflict has crossed into naval warfare, and both sides have stated they will not stop.